A Love Letter to America by Tomas David Schuman. Copyright 1984. Dear Americans, my name is Tomas David Schuman. I am what you may call a defector from the USSR, and I have a message for you. I love you very much. I love all of you, liberals and conservatives, decadent capitalists and oppressed masses, blacks and whites and browns and yellows, rednecks and intellectuals. For me, you are the people who created a unique nation, country, and society in the history of mankind. By no means a perfect one, but let's face it, the most free, affluent, and just in today's world. I am not alone in this love. People all over the earth, whether they praise America or bitterly criticize her, look upon you as the only hope for mankind's survival and the last stronghold of freedom. Some may not think in these idealistic terms, but they certainly enjoy the fruits of your civilization, often forgetting to be grateful for them. Millions of people in the so-called socialist camp or in the third world literally owe their lives to America. As a wartime child, I survived partly thanks to such decadent capitalists, as the Soviets say, things as spam meat, condensed milk, and egg powder that were supplied to my country by the USA through the Lend-Lease program of World War II. In the Soviet Union, we secretly but proudly call ourselves the spam generation. Too prosaic? Who cares about spam in today's USA, apart from underprivileged welfare recipients? Well, for me, these foods are not merely the nostalgic delight of my troubled childhood, but rather a symbol of love from a friend when I was in need. No amount of communist propaganda against America has ever been able to convince me that the United States was out to colonize and exploit. I will tell you, many people have been more than willing to be exploited the American way. For what other reason have thousands risked their lives, gone to unimaginable troubles, left behind their families, their motherland, and traditional ways of life to come to America? Have you ever heard of illegal aliens risking their lives crossing the border at midnight into socialist USSR? Or the boat people swimming oceans and drowning by the thousands just to reach the shores of communist China? Or defectors like me leaving behind relative affluence and risking bullets in the back in order to join the progressive workers' paradise in Russia? No, we all come here to America, obviously willing to be exploited by capitalists and enjoy oppression together with you, because we believe and know America is a better place. I am writing this not to please you with words you want to hear. The rest of my message may be more unpleasant to you than even communist propaganda, or more offensive than the speeches of leaders in Kremlin. But as a true friend of America, I want to help. My dear friends, I think you are in big trouble, whether you believe it or not. You are at war, and you may lose this war very soon, together with all your affluence and freedoms, unless you start defending yourselves. I hope you have noticed on your color televisions that there is in fact war going on right now all over this planet. This war has many faces, but it's all the same. It's war. Some call it national liberation. Some title it class struggle, or political terrorism. Others call it anti-colonialism or struggle for majority rule. Some even come up with such fancy names as War of Patriotic Forces or Peace Movement. I call it World Communist Aggression. I know what I am talking about, because I was on the side of the aggressor before I decided to take your side. I do not believe, I know, that in this war no one is being liberated, decolonized, or made equal, as Soviet doctrine proclaims. You may notice, if you give yourselves the trouble to observe, that the only equality and liberation this war produces is the equality of death and the liberation from freedom. Look at Russia, Poland, Hungary, Afghanistan. Would you say the people of those countries celebrated and rejoiced when the Soviets brought them equality and liberation? Of course not. We must take a clear and honest look at what Soviet liberation actually means. This war of communist world aggression is not fought against some mythological capitalists, as communist propaganda claims. No, my dear friends, this war is fought against you, personally. Communist wars of world aggression are not fought for liberty and equality. We have thousands of unequivocal examples of the horrendous human suffering, torture, and mass death that occur after a Soviet liberation. The final stage of communist aggression, military confrontation, has very little to do with rivalry for territorial or geopolitical gains in order to free and liberate. Communist world aggression is a total war against humanity and human civilization. In communist propaganda terms, this is the final struggle for the victory of communism. The driving force of this war has very little to do with natural aspirations of people for better lives and greater freedoms. If at all, these aspirations are being used and taken advantage of by the manipulators and progenitors of the war. The real driving force of this war of aggression is ideology, something you cannot eat, wear, or store for a rainy day. An integral part of this war of ideology is ideological subversion, the process of changing the perception of reality in the minds of millions of peoples all over the world. The late comrade Andropov, the former head of the Soviet KGB, called this war of communist aggression the final struggle for the minds and hearts of the people. The reason that I am so certain of the real goal of communist aggression is that I was actually a part and an unwilling instrument of Soviet subversion tactics. Having been trained and used by the KGB for their global ideological subversion campaign, I have some first-hand knowledge about the people behind this war and the methods they use. I know very well the way the communists, whom the Western media call freedom fighters and rebels, operate. I know their mentality and their methods. I know their ultimate goals, which are very far from the liberty, equality, and freedom they verbally espouse. Because I have seen the tragic consequences of this war of ideological subversion. I would like to offer some suggestions as to how we in the United States can defend ourselves against this deadly war, and how we can survive in this final struggle for minds and hearts. What's in it for Tomas Schuman, you may ask? Well, I've asked myself, what do I get for defecting from the winning side, the Soviets, and joining the losers? I hope I don't have to tell you that at least a dozen countries have succumbed to the communists since my defection. In reality, dear friends, I have gained nothing materially from my defection. What I have gained is a firm commitment to the United States as the last real frontier of freedom. This is it, dear Americans. Your country, and mine now, will be the last to be liberated by Marxist, socialist, and domestic do-gooders. If the liberationists succeeded in bringing their new order to America, chances are you and I meet in front of a firing squad, or worse, in a re-education forced labor camp in the Alaskan People's Democratic Republic. You have too many concrete examples of what communist liberation has done for other countries to believe that I am wrong when I warn you that we are on the brink of disaster. From one that has lived, worked, and seen firsthand the realities of day-to-day life in a communist socialist state, you must wake up now and start defending the rights and freedoms you now have. No matter how many problems you think the U.S. may have, believe me when I say that they are nothing in comparison to the troubles you will experience if the U.S. continues to agree and sympathize with communist socialist doctrines. I have made my choice to be with you, the nation I love. I have risked my life, like many others, to tell you of my life and experiences within a communist state. You have nothing to risk by listening to me and making up your mind as to whether I am a Cold War paranoid, as your media calls me, or whether my message makes sense. The choice is yours. My life story. I was born in Moscow in 1939 under the name of Yuri Bezmenov. My father was an officer of the Soviet Army General Staff. As inspector of the land forces, he was stationed in fraternal countries such as Mongolia, Cuba, and East Germany. Were he alive today, he would most likely be checking the status of Soviet troops in Angola, Ethiopia, Yemen, Syria, Vietnam, Cambodia, Nicaragua, and the ever-growing number of other liberated countries of the world. I was brought up under the shadow of Comrade Stalin, to the echo of the World War II. As a loyal and patriotically minded young communist, I loved my country, good or bad. However, unlike certain Western intellectuals and liberals, I did not require half a century to realize that the leaders of my country are self-imposed dictators, mass murderers, and that the ideology of Marxism-Leninism is an absolutely false system that produces none of the advantages or benefits of the workers' paradise that it promises. It was a simple matter for me to compare the Soviet propaganda claims given to all Russian citizens of glorious socialist achievements with the surrounding realities. Early morning bread lines, because we had so little to eat. The frequency of arrest of quote-unquote enemies of the people, and the omnipresent fear of the KGB. Because of my wartime childhood spent in the Asian section of the USSR, I developed an early affection for the Oriental way of life, and at the age of 17, after graduating from elementary school, I entered the Institute of Oriental Languages, an affiliate of Moscow State University. The institute was actually under the direct control of KGB and Communist Central Committee, an elitist nest for future Soviet diplomats, foreign correspondents, and spies. At the institute, while studying several foreign language and mass media, I was required to also take compulsory military training. During training, we students were taught how to play strategic war games using the maps of foreign countries. Civil defense and anti-nuclear training were also essential parts of our education. In addition, we took interrogation classes, which were designed to teach us how to interrogate prisoners of war. In particular, we were instructed to interrogate prisoners as to their reaction to a Soviet nuclear strike aimed at their country. It was for me a bizarre experience. Upon graduating, I was sent to India as a translator for the Soviet Economic Aid Group, which was building oil refineries in 2 Indian states. Here, during my first foreign assignment, I realized the great discrepancy between my country's proclaimed goals of selfless fraternal cooperation and the actual ruthless exploitation of India by Soviet neo-colonists. As an example of this exploitation, the Soviets, in purchasing Indian manufactured goods, would pay the Indians only in rubles. Unfortunately, rubles are non-convertible currency on the international market, meaning that the Indian manufacturer would be unable to purchase anything on the international market with his Soviet rubles. On the other hand, the Soviets would take the Indian manufactured goods and sell them at a substantial profit on the international market for hard currency such as dollars or pounds, which are easily negotiable. So basically, the Indian manufacturer received only a fraction of the actual worth of his product, while the Soviets reaped the rewards of their duplicity. Is it that the Indians are stupid, ignorant people, that they allow the Soviets to deceive them in this manner? On the contrary, for the most part, they are innocent victims of one of the world's most sophisticated con games, ideological subversion. They have been psychologically manipulated through media, politics, etc., into believing that the Soviets are their friends, who are protecting them from the Western imperialists. This same subversion game is being played all over the world, even in America. KGB influence in our media, politics, and nearly every phase of our life has produced a growing conviction on the part of many Americans that we are the quote-unquote bad guys. Again, I have to remind you that to date, there has never been a single defection from the United States. The Soviets have produced an absolutely ludicrous global lie that people are believing. Why? Because the tactics of ideological subversion work. Even after witnessing the ruthless tactics used by my country, I still naively hoped that things would turn out for the better eventually. After all, I was a product of the post-Stalin era of thaw and liberalization started by Khrushchev. I believed in socialism with a human face. That faith was shattered irreparably only 5 years later when I witnessed the brutal Soviet military intervention into fraternal Czechoslovakia in 1968. After completing my first assignment in India in 1965, I was recalled to Moscow and immediately joined the Novosti press agency. Novosti means news in Russian. The biggest and most powerful propaganda, espionage, and ideological front of the KGB. I was employed by Novosti as an apprentice for their classified department of political publications, GRPP, under Comrade Norman Borodin. After working a short time, I discovered that about 75% of the Novosti's staffers were actually KGB officers. The other 25% were co-optees or KGB freelance writers, PR officers, informers like myself. The other interesting fact I discovered was that there was no news at Novosti. My main job, apart from writing, editing, and translating propaganda materials to be planted in foreign media, was accompanying delegations of Novosti's guests, journalists, editors, publishers, writers, politicians, and businessmen from foreign countries on tours of the USSR or to international conferences held in the Soviet Union. In actuality, as a freelance journalist, I did absolutely no writing or news coverage at all. After several months, I was formally recruited by the KGB as an informer, while still maintaining my position as a Novosti journalist. My work with the KGB entailed combining my journalistic duties with the collection of intelligence data and the spreading of disinformation to foreign countries for the purposes of Soviet propaganda and subversion. It was only a matter of time before the KGB realized that my personal friendships with the guests of Novosti Press Agency could also be utilized for their operations. Why did I allow myself to be recruited? There really is no simple answer. For one thing, a Soviet journalist cannot simply say no to the KGB if he wants to remain alive, free, pursue his career, and travel abroad. He simply must cooperate with the KGB or suffer the consequences. Secondly, apart from monetary and material gains, a Soviet journalist, co-opted, hired by the KGB, has a rare chance to become important in his own country. And in 1965, the USSR was still my country. Many of my colleagues, both cynicists and true patriots, joined the KGB, naively believing that they could promote themselves to the higher positions of power, while maintaining their secretly kept moral principles and disguising their actual disgust of the system. By the time most of them realized that power corrupts and that allegiance with the Soviet communist power corrupts absolutely, it was too late. The majority of my former colleagues are now firmly entrenched in the privileged class, and their humanistic ideals have all been traded, one by one, for small comforts such as a private car, a rare thing in the USSR, a free apartment, a country house, dacha, free trips abroad, and freedom to socialize with foreigners, none of which would be possible or available to the average Russian worker. So despite my early dislike of the Soviet communist system, I joined the KGB, hoping in some way to outsmart them, to play the game until I could see more clearly how to proceed. My rapid promotion followed. I was once again assigned to India, this time as a USSR press officer and a PR agent for the KGB. Because of my knowledge of India and her languages, Hindi and Urdu, I became deeply involved in the KGB operations in India. I was directed by my superiors to slowly but surely establish the Soviet sphere of influence in India. It did not take me long to discover that our group was engaged in neither research nor counter-propaganda. Behind locked doors, we accumulated intelligence from various sources, including Indian informers and agents, regarding virtually every important and politically significant citizen of India. Members of parliament, civil servicemen, military and public figures, media people, businessmen, university professors, radical or otherwise students and writers. In other words, everyone instrumental in shaping the public opinion and policies of the nation. Those who were friendly and ready to invite the Soviet expansionist policy into their own country were promoted to higher positions of power, affluence, and prestige through various operations by KGB Novosti. Large groups of the so-called progressive and sober-thinking Indians were on a regular basis generously supplied with duty-free booze from the embassy stocks. Soviet sympathizers were invited to the USSR for free trips and numerous international conferences, where they not only received substantial sums of money in the form of literary awards or Nehru Peace and Friendship prizes, but were also medically treated for VD or hernias acquired in the perpetual class struggle against American imperialism. Those who refused to be flexible and take a voluntary role in this cruel farce were thoroughly character assassinated in the sensation-hungry media and press. Let me give you an example of how the KGB uses the information it collects. One day in 1968, I was routinely scanning through the backlog of USA Information Service releases and classified documentation generously supplied to us by our Indian and American friends in one of the dispatches. I read that the South Vietnamese city of Hue had been captured by the Hanoi Communists. When it was recaptured by the U.S. Army and Allied forces only 2 days later, the CIA discovered to their horror that several thousand Vietnamese teachers, priests, Buddhists, businessmen, and educated citizens, everyone who was pro-American, had been rounded up by the invaders and in one night taken out of the city limits and executed collectively. Some were shot, others, with their hands tied by electric wire, were found with their skulls crushed by shovels and iron bars. How could they possibly have located all of these people within only a few hours in a large city? The Americans wondered. I thought I knew the answer. Long before the invasion, there was an extensive network of communist informers working under the guidance of the Soviet embassy in Hanoi, that is, under the KGB. The communists filed every bit of information, addresses, personal habits, political affiliations, expressed ideas, unexpressed thoughts revealed in informal and private conversations, even the names and addresses of relatives, friends, even lovers and mistresses of the future victims of liberation. After reading the news release, I was sick, physically, with the realization that the department I was working for in New Delhi was engaged in exactly the same activity that had been used in the city of Hue. I realized fully that I was a part of a heinous crime against our host country. Adding to my nausea, I discovered that some of our files contained data of a personal nature. intimate information such as sexual preferences, e.g., homosexuality, of certain Indian VIPs, even radicals and communists openly sympathetic to Soviet policies. Were they also listed for execution if a Soviet-backed revolution in India should occur? My frustration was compounded by my KGB supervisor, who coached me in a fatherly tone. Don't bother with these prostitutes, the Indian communists. Don't waste your time with them. There is nothing more dangerous than disillusioned true believers in communism. They turn into the most bitter enemies and counter-revolutionaries. Aim higher at respectable, conservative, well-established capitalists and pro-American elements. So as you can see, the KGB Soviets have absolutely no respect for the majority of their new converts. One event in particular that solidified my increasing horror of KGB tactics concerned one of my closest Indian friends, a journalist who represented one of the most influential newspapers in India. When I discovered that my friend had been targeted for a KGB character assassination, I felt a tremendous desire to escape from the USSR embassy immediately and to confide to my Indian friend the situation confronting him, and also my desire to break my ties with the KGB, which meant defection. However, such an impulse scheme could have hardly succeeded. The Indian government, under strong pressure from the Soviet embassy, had adopted a law which stated that no defector from any country has a right of political asylum in any embassy in the territory of the Republic of India. This masterpiece of political hypocrisy had been created by Mrs. Indira Gandhi after Stalin's daughter Svetlana defected to the West while residing in India. Because of this situation, I knew full well that my defection would not be a simple matter, and as a result, it required a carefully thought out plan. To be caught by the KGB while attempting defection would mean that I would be forcefully returned to Russia and imprisoned, perhaps worse. I therefore resolved to wait until I had formed a definite plan for my escape. However, my patience was running thin. One of the last straws for me was a story I heard from one of my KGB colleagues. I learned that the Soviet Union was importing Soviet-trained subversives to East Pakistan in preparation for a revolution there. My colleague further informed me that Soviet cases marked printed matter to Dhaka University, stored in the basement of the USSR consulate in Calcutta, were accidentally discovered to contain not university texts, but rather Kalashnikov guns, AK-47s, and ammunition for the anticipated communist revolution in Pakistan. This incident occurred in December of 1969. 2 months later, I quote-unquote disappeared from the USSR embassy in New Delhi in order to avoid detection by the Indian police and the KGB. I had disguised myself as an American hippie. The method of defection was actually a guaranteed success. No KGB detective in his right mind would have thought to look for a missing Soviet diplomat among the crowds of long-haired, bearded, barefoot, hashish-smoking Americans who had invaded India in search of enlightenment. And so I escaped to the West. I landed successfully in Canada in July 1970. There I studied history and political science, taught Russian language and literature, and worked for the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation as an announcer, producer for Radio Canada International, an equivalent of the Voice of America. I was later forced to resign from my position with the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation due to a complaint made by the USSR ambassador to Canada to the Canadian government stating that I was anti-Soviet. Realizing that I did not have the support of the Canadian government for having made my choice not to perform acts for the KGB and Soviet Russia that violated my sense of justice and right action, I came to America. Presently, I am a freelance writer and political analyst, trying, though not always successfully, to awaken the Western populace to the realities of life under the Soviet system and to the ideological subversion that is being practiced upon them daily. It is my hope that this booklet and the follow-up booklets that I am now writing will make clear to all who read them the real facts behind the barrage of false media, ideas, and information from the Soviet Union that represent the communist state as a worker's paradise. Believe me when I say, having lived through it, it was no paradise. Prelude to Subversion. All warfare is based primarily on deception of an enemy. Fighting on a battlefield is the most primitive way of making war. There is no art higher than to destroy your enemy without a fight, by subverting anything of value in enemy's country. Sun Tzu, Chinese philosopher, 500 BC. The art of duping the masses into doing things to their own disadvantage and making them believe it is, quote-unquote, the will of the people is as ancient as mankind itself. The essence of subversion is best expressed in the famous Marxist slogan, if you substitute proletarians for a more appropriate word. Useful idiots of the world, unite! To achieve the desired effect, the subverter must first make idiots out of normal people and divide them before turning the people into a homogenized mass of useful and united idiots. Tanks and missiles may or may not be needed at final stage. For the time being, they are simply the means of terrorizing people into inaction and submission. 500 years before Christ, the Chinese military strategist Sun Tzu formulated the principle of subversion this way. 1. Cover with ridicule all of the valid traditions in your opponent's country. 2. Implicate their leaders in criminal affairs and turn them over to the scorn of the populace at the right time. 3. Disrupt the work of their government by every means. 4. Do not shun the aid of the lowest and most despicable individuals of your enemy's country. 5. Spread disunity and dispute among the citizens. 6. Turn the young against the old. 7. Be generous with promises and rewards to collaborators and accomplices. Sound familiar? About 2,500 years later, we can read this very same instruction in a secret document allegedly authored by the Communist International for their young revolutionaries. The document is titled Rules of Revolution. 1. Corrupt the young, get them interested in sex, take them away from religion, make them superficial and enfeebled. 2. divide the people into hostile groups by constantly harping on controversial issues of no importance. 3. Destroy people's faith in their national leaders by holding the latter up for contempt, ridicule, and disgrace. 4. Always preach democracy, but seize power as fast and as ruthlessly as possible. 5. By encouraging government extravagances, destroy its credit, produce years of inflation with rising prices and general discontent. 6. Incite unnecessary strikes in vital industries, encourage civil disorders, and foster a lenient and soft attitude on the part of the government towards such disorders. 7. Cause breakdown of the old moral virtues: honesty, sobriety, self-restraint, faith in the pledged word. I cannot vouch for authenticity of this document, which, according to American conservative media, was captured by the Allied forces after World War II in defeated Germany in Dusseldorf. But I can assure you that these quote-unquote rules are almost a literal interpretation of those theories and practices which I learned from my KGB superiors and colleagues within the Novosti press agency. Yes, I am well aware of the possibility that nothing I write here is a sensational revelation to many of you. What I did was simply to structure my knowledge and experience with the Soviet subversion system into a simple and graphic record, to help you to get an overall picture of the subversion process. Let me first outline for you the movement of a target nation from the state of open society to a closed one. This outline is taken from secret, not so secret, and absolutely non-secret Marxist literature. An open society is the one you are living now. You can work in it or choose not to work, have private property or have nothing at all, love it or leave it, criticize it without fear of being declared an enemy of the people. It is a society based on free individual initiative and the free market system. All you have to do to screw up the status quo of a free nation is to borrow one false idea from the ideology of a communist or totalitarian government. For the sake of simplicity, I have chosen the idea of egalitarianism. People born equal, therefore must be equal. Sounds great, but look at yourselves. Were you born equal? Some of you weighed 7 pounds at birth, others 6 or 5. Are you now equal? In any way? Physically, mentally, emotionally, racially, spiritually? Some are tall and dumb, others short, bald, and clever. Now let's figure out what will happen if we legislate equality and make the concept of quote-unquote equality a cornerstone and pillar of socio-economical and political system. Alright? You don't have to be a great economist or sociologist to foresee that some of the people who are less equal would demand as much as those who are more equal by law. Aha, now you've got it. There will be some who get more for giving less and take advantage of those who are even less equal, say in the art of taking. And to avoid the squabble for quote-unquote equal redistribution, you will have to introduce a third force, the state. Why? Because people were never equal, are not equal, and if God wanted us to be equal, He would probably have made us equal. No, He provided a difference. Vive la différence, said the French before the French Revolution. And they were right. The beauty of the best, most successful political, economic system created by the fathers of America has nothing to do with legislated or enforced equality. The American Republic is based on the principle of equal opportunities for unequal and very much different and diverse individuals to develop their abilities and to coexist in mutually beneficial cooperation. And that is an entirely different story. That much I knew even from the Soviet textbooks of American history. Now let's move faster. People who have declared themselves to be equal will inevitably come to expect more for their individual needs, which sooner or later will tragically come to conflict with the quote-unquote unequal reality. That will automatically produce discontent. Unhappy and discontent masses are less productive than those who are happy being what they are and making the best of it. Decreased productivity, as we all know, leads to such unpleasant things as inflation, unemployment, and recession. These in turn cause social unrest and instability, both economical and political. Chronic instability breeds radicalism as a means of solving problems. Radicalism is the precondition of a power struggle which may and has often resulted in violent and forceful replacements of power structures. If the situation deteriorates badly, this replacement takes ugly forms of internal civil war or revolution, or invasion of a quote-unquote friendly and fraternal neighbor, and finally ends up in the traditional way, namely state control. Depending on maturity of a nation and the amount or absence of common sense, this control will manifest itself in the creation of a closed society, the opposite of what we had in the beginning. Borders are closed, censorship of the media is established, irritants and enemies of the state are executed, etc. This is my simplistic and highly unscientific outline of the events which have happened in many countries of the world. Any nation is able to do this to herself without any help from comrades Andropov and Brezhnev and their numerous KGB agents. Any one of you can easily observe this vicious chain of events by simply reading your newspapers regularly or even watching the TV. The 4 stages of subversion. What many of you do not see is the second chain of events, which I graphically represent in the following chart of the 4 stages of subversion. 1. Demoralization. 2. Destabilization. 3. Crisis. 4. Normalization. What has all this to do with the KGB? Very simple. These are the most favorable conditions listed in any Marxist textbook of revolutionary struggle. I have simply placed them in chronological order and divided them into 3 vertical columns: the areas of application, the methods of subversion, and the expected or achieved results. In the context of the USA, most of these nasty things are done to America by Americans, with the ideological help of the communist subverters. Most of the actions are overt, legitimate, and easily identifiable. The only trouble is they are quote-unquote stretched in time. In other words, the process of subversion is such a long-term process that an average individual, due to the short time span of his historical memory, is unable to perceive the process of subversion as a consistent and willful effort. That is exactly how it is intended to be. Like the small hand of your watch. You know it moves, but you cannot see it moving. The main principle of ideological subversion is turning a stronger force against itself. Just like in the Japanese martial arts, you do not stop the blow of a heavier, more powerful enemy with an equally forceful blow. You may simply hurt your hand. Instead, you catch the striking fist with your hand and pull the enemy in the direction of his blow until he crashes into a wall or any other heavy object in his way. America is obviously a stronger force that communism is unable to defeat, but it is possible to conquer this nation using the preconditions I have described, created by Americans themselves, and diverting America's attention away from these mortally dangerous preconditions. The situation is similar to a house, the owners of which have stored explosives and inflammable materials inside. To destroy this house, the enemy does not have to intrude physically into it. It is enough to start a fire next door and wait till the wind blows in the right direction. Meanwhile, the enemy may throw in some great ideas for the owners to argue about in order to take their attention off the actual fire. Environmental protection, gay liberation, or emancipation of house pets are the types of non-critical arguments that divert America's attention from the real danger. Smart people would notice the fire and remove the inflammable objects and materials before the house catches fire. Useful idiots will keep arguing about whether it is constitutional or not to pay firefighters, or the equality of husband and wife in domestic chores, who should remove the combustibles, until the actual explosion blows their enfeebled brains all over the neighborhood. Now let us get back to my chart. I know it is going to be somewhat boring, but my purpose is not to entertain, but to explain what my former KGB bosses consider important for your quote-unquote liberation. Stage 1. Demoralization. This process has many names: psychological warfare, ideological aggression, propaganda warfare, etc. The KGB calls it active measures. Since my defection from the USSR embassy in 1970, I have been trying desperately to explain to the Western media, politicians, intelligence community, and your academic Sovietologists that active measures are more important and dangerous than classic espionage, James Bond style. At long last, in 1983, in his new book, KGB Today, John Barron accurately and excellently described the process of demoralization, basing some of his analysis on the data supplied by another KGB defector, KGB official Stanislav Levchenko. Incidentally, my former schoolmate from the Oriental Studies Institute, who was later stationed in Tokyo, Japan, under the guise of correspondent with New Time magazine. Stanislav Levchenko succeeded where I failed. He brought the active measures to the attention of American public. The purpose of this process is to change your perception of reality to such an extent that even despite an abundance of information and evidence about the danger of communism, you are unable to come to sensible conclusions in your own interest and in the interest of your nation. John Barron ominously titled one chapter of his book dedicated to analysis of the active measures, "Reality Upside Down." Excellent title. This is exactly what my KGB gurus of subversion in Novosti press agency taught me. One of the main tactics in this process is to develop, establish, and consistently enforce a set of double standards, one in relation to the USSR, another to the USA. Western analysts have already pointed out the diverse tactics of active measures. Some of these were exactly the ones I was trained to use while working with foreign delegations in Moscow and the USSR Embassy in New Delhi. Overt and covert propaganda, use of agents of influence, faked international forums created by KGB Novosti to bring the atmosphere of legitimacy and respectability to Soviet operations, provoking and manipulating mass demonstrations and assemblies, spreading rumors and reliable information from circles close to Politburo, forgeries of U.S. Information Service press releases, planting phony stories in local media, creating hundreds of tabloid newspapers subsided by the USSR Embassy through front organizations and fake advertising companies for the purpose of legally financing groups of subversives and radicals, etc. Other tactics such as sabotage, character assassination of stubborn Indians resisting Soviet subversion, terrorism, and even occasional killings of reactionaries and counter-revolutionaries for the psychological effect of paralyzing with fear. These also were used by my KGB colleagues from other departments of the USSR Embassy. I am less familiar with these aspects of the subversion process. My role as a legitimate and overt public relations man and a charismatic socializer was directed by the KGB mainly at the initial stage of subversion. After a certain period of befriending and cultivating foreigners, I had to provide my KGB supervisor with my psychological assessment of the target individual or group and pass them over to the professionals for further processing and recruitment. Nevertheless, I was able to reconstruct the overall picture of the process rather accurately and, unlike the Western Sovietologists, come to more systematic and logical description of subversion. What I offer you now is a chart as simple as a multiplication table and as complex as calculus. The first time this chart has ever been published in its entirety. Let us start with the first stage of demoralization. It takes about 15 to 20 years to demoralize a nation. Why that many or few? Simple. This is the minimum number of years needed to educate one generation of students in a target country, America for example, and expose them to the ideology of the subverter. It is imperative that any sufficient challenge and counterbalance by the basic moral values and ideology of this country be eliminated. In absence of any cohesive and consistent national ideology, the task of the subverter becomes even easier. In the USA, as we all know, there is multiplicity of ideas and ideologies today. Without proper emphasis on the main and basic American ideology of the original republic and the free market system, it is not even considered intellectual or fashionable these days to subscribe entirely to this outmoded set of ideas. To be successful, the process of subversion at the stage of demoralization must be always and only a two-way street, which means that the target nation must be made a recipient, passive or active, of the ideas of the subverter. Democracy is by definition a recipient of a multiplicity of ideologies and values, whether good or bad. Unfortunately, bad ideas are often proven and revealed only after a long period of time, during which many have absorbed them and allowed them to change their nation's attitudes and behavior. Ancient Japanese rulers understood this principle very well when they virtually isolated their nation from any foreign influence, good, bad, or neutral. Imperial Japan was preserved in its own set of historical values long enough to bring up a mature and morally stable nation able to make the change to an entirely new technological civilization with negligible damage to national fiber. More than that, the Japanese, although reluctantly, opened up to Western values and surpassed the West in the shortest possible historical span since the World War II, becoming one of the greatest industrialized and technologically advanced powers in the world. Without such maturity, a nation may ill conceive even the most favorable foreign influence, which is clearly demonstrated by a number of decolonized third world countries prematurely embracing parliamentary democracy. But if and when an outside influence is purposely ill-intended, an immature nation, or a nation with a neglected indigenous ideology, America, automatically becomes a recipient of subversion in its early stage of demoralization. The successful demoralization is an irrevocable process, at least for another generation. Why? Let us take an example. The semi-literate and unstable American generation of the crazy 1960s is now approaching the age of 40. These people, who were too preoccupied with protesting the Vietnam War, the drug rock music scene, taking part in love-ins, etc., to study and prepare for assuming their civil responsibilities, are now in positions of power and decision-making in government, business, media, social life, entertainment, Hollywood, military, and intelligence services. Not all of them, okay? Some of them are. You are stuck with them until they retire or resign. You cannot fire them. It's against union regulations. You cannot, unlike the USSR, send them to Alaska after declaring them enemies of the people. You cannot even openly and effectively criticize them. They have invaded the media and control public opinion. Unless you want to be called McCarthyist, you cannot change their attitudes and mores. At this age, people are usually set in their ways as individuals. You are stuck with them. They change your attitudes and opinions. They navigate the domestic and foreign affairs. They are making decisions and choices for you, whether you like it or not. To change the direction of America's future and to return to the basic American values, proven to be efficient and productive for almost 200 years of historically unprecedented freedom and affluence, you have to educate a new generation of Americans, this time in the spirit of patriotism and capitalism. Alright, you don't want to return. You rather have something new and progressive and constructive to make America once again respected and loved all over the world, so that the recipients of the U.S. aid no longer shout, "Yankee, go home." In any case, even if you start the education of a new generation of Americans right this minute, it will take you the next 15 to 20 years to raise this new generation to the levels of power and authority. You may reduce this period of time if you can make an enormous all-nation effort in an atmosphere of prevailing unity and consensus. It would take a miracle or another national disaster, such as a new world war, God forbid, to make Americans embrace one American ideology and to act in one direction after decades of disunity, disputes, partisan antagonisms, and self-castigation. Therefore, let's be realistic. The demoralization, whether self-inflicted or imported, is usually an irreversible, for one generation at least, process. The three levels of demoralization. Now let us see the same stage of demoralization from the standpoint of the subverter. Communist manipulators divide the areas of application of their effects into three levels. The process of demoralization operates simultaneously on all three levels, which I call, for the sake of simplicity, 1. The level of ideas, consciousness. 2. The level of structures, socio-political set of a nation. And 3. The level of life, which includes all the areas of material existence of a nation, the fiber of life, so to say. Level 1. Ideas rule the world. The level of ideas, the highest level of subversion, affects such vital areas as religion, education, media, and culture, to name just a few of the most important ones. If we look back in history of mankind, we may notice that the greatest upheavals and changes were caused by ideas, by faith and beliefs, not by knowledge or things. Few people sacrifice their comforts and lives for such trivial things as a new car. Scientific knowledge seldom generates strong collective emotions. Many scientists have preferred life and affluence to death for scientific truth. I have never heard of a man who would staunchly face a firing squad for the sake of defending the truth of the law of gravity, or 2 times 2 equals 4. But faith in the seemingly irrelevant, at the time, and immaterial teachings of Jesus Christ generated such tremendous moral force in millions of human beings for the past 2,000 years that people willingly and happily accept violent death and tortures rather than deny their belief in Christ. Communism and its Marxist-Leninist dogma, according to some thinkers, Dr. George Steiner for one, is another distorted form of faith, able to inspire martyrdom in millions. Substituting the traditional values of the Judeo-Christian heritage with this Marxist satanic faith is one of the basic principles of subversion at the stage of demoralization. The highest and most effective level of ideas. The methods are as primitive as they are predictable. You do not have to be a graduate of a KGB school or Harvard University to figure out what kind of interaction between the subverter, KGB, and target, American brains, occurs on this level. Or the subverter, be it Andropov's KGB or any other purposeful group or organization hell-bent on the idea of a new world order, has to do is to study the areas where your nation's ideas could be eroded and substituted, and then slowly but consistently affect these areas by sending infiltrating agents of influence to inject new ideas, disseminate propagandist literature, and encourage self-destructive tendencies. All the subverter has to do to remove the spiritual backbone of America is to help you to politicize, commercialize, and entertainment allies the dominant religions. There are many other contributing factors the subverter can also take advantage of, such as the development and spreading of various religious cults, including satanic and death cults, preaching moral relativity and removing religion and prayer, any prayer, from schools, creating personality cults in religion whereby the preacher becomes the center and object of divine worship, not God. Often your religious charlatans claim to be incarnations of God or even God himself, etc. I have selected the above three main methods because I am most familiar with them. These methods were used by myself and my KGB Novosti colleagues, and these methods have proven to be sufficiently efficient. We did not have to bother with such silliness, for example, as recruiting Billy Graham and forcing him to tell outrageous lies about the existence of religious freedom in the Soviet Union, in state-run churches in Moscow. Let's start with the most innocent method of destroying religion, namely, making it entertaining. To attract people and money to established religious organizations, some churches have literally become theaters, conducting variety shows featuring celebrities from the entertainment industry who perform for fees. The KGB agents of influence may or may not have to physically manipulate these entertainment arrangements. The indiscriminate choice of the celebrities for these church performances is usually quite pleasing to the KGB. A group of rock or pop musicians with a message of social justice, sugar-coated in popular spiritual tunes, can be actually more helpful to the KGB than someone standing in the pulpit preaching Marxist-Leninist doctrine. The sugar-sweet messages of social equality from the crooning mouths of the entertainers is quite enough to accomplish the aims of the KGB without any overt activity on their part. Commercialization of religion does the same thing. If the church has to solicit your money and remind you over and over again in every TV show to contribute with telephone numbers to pledge donations, that only means and infers that there is something basically wrong with your faith. Faithful people do not have to be asked for money. They tithe to their churches voluntarily and eagerly. Unhealthy competition for donations between various electronic churches does two things beneficial to the subverter. One, it makes religion dependent on the most successful salesmen of God, and these salesmen may not necessarily be, they don't have to be, of the highest moral standards. Thus, truly moral, God-centered people are turned off by organized religion. And two, it empties regular churches, where you have to practice your religion by personal physical presence and participation and involvement. All the subverter has to do now is to keep on further discrediting the main body of the church by harping at religion in general as, quote, just another means of the capitalist exploitation of masses and a profit-oriented opiate of the people, end quote. And the Soviet propaganda and its fronts, such as Novosti Press Agency, does exactly that, and quite successfully, through thousands of liberal and leftist media establishments in the USA. Politicizing religion is the most efficient method of demoralizing a target nation. Once a nation starts giving to Caesar what belongs to God and getting God involved in such things as social justice and partisan political squabbles, it predictably loses what religion calls mercy and the grace of God. To put it in atheistic terms, A target country allows the subverter to use the area of moral values for dissemination and enforcement of amoral ideas and policies. The most powerful instrument of this process is an organization called World Council of Churches, infiltrated by the KGB to such extent that it is hard to distinguish these days a priest from a spy. Being a public relations officer for Novosti, I accompanied many foreign members of the WCC during their visits to the USSR. Some of them struck me as individuals pathologically unable to say or hear truth. They were simply allergic to any facts or opinions which would undermine their spiritual affiliation with the Soviet manipulators. Archbishop and President Makarios of Cyprus was one such religious visitor, skillfully combining both God's and Caesar's things. Makarios was extremely effective in bringing the desperately needed air of legitimacy and holiness to the junta of the Soviet mass murderers and oppressors of religion. His photogenic presence at various international forums in Moscow greatly promoted acceptability of the Soviet influence in the non-aligned and developing countries. When, after my defection to the West, I find Trotskyite publications in a United Church of Canada, or see Nicaraguan Catholic Church fathers with Soviet-made Kalashnikov machine guns hung over their church robes, or read about humanitarian aid from the American Council of Churches given to African mass murderers and terrorists who were trained in my old country by the KGB, I do not suspect, I know these things to be what they are, direct results of the communist subversion of religion. I do not need any evidence of links between the KGB and the church. The complete confusion of God-related and politically subverted related goals are obvious. In the extreme left column of my chart, you can see the results of demoralization in each individual area on each level of subversion. The result of the demoralization of religion is a phenomenon referred to as the death wish. This expression is borrowed from a book by a Soviet dissident writer, Igor Shafarevich, titled Socialism as a Historical Phenomenon, Paris, 1977. Dr. Shafarevich, in analyzing the dead civilizations of Egypt, Maya, Mohenjo-Daro, Babylon, etc., comes to an ominous conclusion. Every one of these civilizations died when people rejected religion and God and tried to create social justice along the socialist principles. Thus, socialism, according to Shafarevich, may be a manifestation of an inborn human instinct of self-destruction, if unrestrained, leading ultimately to physical death of all mankind. Mass education. This is another area of subversion at the stage of demoralization. The Marxist-Leninist concept of education emphasizes environment and mass character of education over individual abilities and quality. When American media enthusiastically reports, repeating Soviet propaganda cliches about achievements of Soviet science, they usually obscure the ideological aspects and purposes of the communist system of education. Massiveness and universality of education attracts Western sociologists and governmental bureaucracies alike. For the developing nations, this seems to be the easiest shortcut to many contemporary problems. The Western public seldom receives the explanation of the price of the state-controlled socialist type education, political conformity to dictatorship, ideological brainwashing, lack of individual initiative in educated masses, lagging behind in development of science and technology. It is a commonly known fact that most of the Soviet technological marvels are stolen, bought, or borrowed from the West. Most of the scientific and technological research in the USSR is productive only and always in the most destructive area, the military. My motherland is still, after more than half-century of victorious socialism, a country without even common household refrigerators, and yet boast of their space exploration and tremendous military might, which have done absolutely nothing to improve the day-to-day life of Soviet citizens. The American romance with state-run education, as encouraged by KGB subverters, has already produced generations of graduates who cannot spell, cannot find Nicaragua on a map, cannot think creatively and independently. I wonder if Albert Einstein would have arrived at his theory of relativity if he had been educated in one of today's American public schools. Most likely, he would have discovered marijuana and variant methods of sexual intercourse instead. Wouldn't you agree that KGB-sponsored demoralization is not going to produce the dynamic, talented, and fruitful young Americans of the future? Contemporary American permissiveness and moral relativity in education have greatly facilitated Soviet ideological subversion tactics. The main methods of Soviet demoralization of American education are: 1. Student exchanges, whereby American students and professors go to Moscow and are exposed to ideological brainwashing, sometimes lacking the proper education that would allow them to assess the Soviet information they receive objectively. 2. Flooding of campus bookstores with Marxist and socialist literature published both in the USSR and by domestic fellow travelers. 3. International seminars and conferences with Soviet participation, where Soviet propaganda seldom is balanced by opposing viewpoints. 4. Infiltration of schools and universities by radicals, leftists, and simply disturbers, often functioning unknowingly under the direct guidance of KGB agents of influence. 5. Establishing numerous student newspapers and magazines staffed with communists and sympathizers. 6. Organizing study groups and circles for dissemination of Soviet propaganda and communist ideology. The eventual result is very predictable: ignorance combined with anti-Americanism. That's good enough for the KGB at this stage of subversion. Lords of public opinion. The American media is a willing recipient of Soviet subversion. I know this because I worked with American journalists and correspondents in Moscow while on the Soviet side, and after my defection to the West. People habitually refer to the American media as free, ignoring the obvious and commonly known fact that most of the most powerful media in the USA is already monopolized both financially and ideologically by what are referred to as liberals. American media chains belong to fewer and fewer owners who do not seem to mind that the media is being almost totally liberalized. Liberalism, in its old classical sense, means above all respect to individual opinion and tolerance to opposing views. However, in my own experience, communist defectors who have requested and sometimes literally begged to have stories of their life in the Soviet Union told to the American people via the major American media have been completely ignored. One of the most devastating methods of Soviet subversion in America is the discrediting of authors like myself and the information and opinion of those who come up with clear evidence of communist crimes against mankind. This method is well described in my forthcoming book, entirely dedicated to the activity of the Novosti press agency. Introduction of non-issues is another powerful method of demoralizing at the level of ideas. It will take another full-size book to describe in detail this method. Suffice it will be here to give a brief definition of non-issues. An issue, the solution of which creates more and bigger problems for majority of a nation, even though it may benefit a few, is a non-issue. Civil rights of homosexuals is not an issue. Defending sexual morality is a larger real issue. The main purpose of non-issues and the devastating result of their introduction is the sidetracking of public opinion, energy, both mental and physical, money and time from the constructive solutions. Soviet propaganda elevated the art of infiltrating and emphasizing non-issues in American public life to the level of actual state policy. Addictive mass culture. Years ago, when I was scanning through a pile of Western newspapers in Novosti's Moscow headquarters, I came across a column written by a Canadian writer, Gregory Clark, in the Toronto Star. Here it is in full. I have saved it for my files. Quote, "If I were a communist agent in America with millions of dollars to spend annually, I would not waste it in bribing public servants to give away state secrets, but I would lavish and encourage the sleazy tunesmiths of that region to turn out more and more garbage culture. Gaggled-headed and obscure musicians would be helped to prominence. I would seek out the more questionable publishers of the dirtier paperbacks and slip them a few $100,000 so they could set up more respectable head offices. Wherever trend shows toward the beat generation, I would offer it a helping hand. Anything that prompted the insubordination of teenagers, anything that contributes to the confusion and exasperation of parents, would be most liberally endowed. The basic intention of my spending would be to break down the discipline, encourage relaxation of authority of every kind so as to build up, in as short time as possible, an adult generation that could easily go out of control. America would look desperately around for any kind of discipline to rescue them, and there, pretty as a picture, would be communism, the most iron-fisted discipline since Sparta. The victory would be bloodless, except of course in concentration camps, torture, prisons, and few things like that, but nobody would know about that because of censorship of the press." End quote. This was written in 1959. The accuracy of this description of our activity stunned me. We had just completed helping a gaggle-headed communist entertainer, Yves Montand, to prominence in Moscow and were halfway through with publicly elevating obscure Indian filmmaker Raj Kapoor to fame. The editorial offices of Novosti were teeming with sleazy foreign singers, poets, writers, artists, musicians, and intellectuals coming to my country for support in their progressive struggle against their own decadent capitalist societies. There is not much I can add to that statement of a wise Canadian columnist today. Yes, KGB encourages demoralization of America through the mass culture by relying upon the help of the useful idiots of the entertainment business. No, the Beatles, punks, and Michael Jackson are not on the KGB payroll. They are on your payroll. All the KGB had to do is to slowly and gradually change your attitudes and kill your resistance to the demoralizing addiction your kids call music. Make it acceptable, normal, make it part of American culture, where it does not belong and never did. The second level of demoralization: structures. There is a Russian proverb which says, quote, "The sly head gives no rest to the arms," end quote. Let us see what communist subversion does to your quote-unquote arms. The socio-political economic structures of America. The areas of application for demoralizing American structures are: 1. Judicial and law enforcement system. 2. Public organizations and institutions dealing with relations between individuals, groups, and classes of the society. 3. Security and defense organs. 4. Internal political parties and groups. 5. Foreign policy, formulating bodies both governmental and non-governmental, think tanks, academia, Sovietology advisors, etc. In the area of quote-unquote law and order, the method of demoralization is to promote and enforce the prevalence of the legalistic approach over the moral one. Several generations of American lawyers and lawmakers graduating from the liberal, that is, leftist, socialist-oriented schools after long-time exposure to the socialist ideology have already created an atmosphere in the U.S. judicial system whereby quote-unquote underprivileged criminals are treated as victims of the cruel American society, and the real victim, the law-abiding society, is turned into defenseless and very underprivileged citizens and taxpayers, paying for a comparatively comfortable life of the criminal in or outside prison. The result is as predictable as it is desirable for the subverter: mistrust of the American population towards their own judicial and law enforcement system, and people demanding harsher punishment and stricter controls in order to fight crime. And what could be better than Soviet or communist type control? Even your liberal media claims that there is no street crime in Moscow and no drug problem in the USSR. Similarly, in the area of social life, by encouraging you to put your individual rights over your obligations, any obligations, private, financial, moral, patriotic, etc., the subverter achieves the desired effect: a society composed of irresponsible individuals, each one quote-unquote doing his own thing and acting according to the law of the jungle. Such subversion of society is the first step toward tyranny. To demoralize America's protective forces, it is enough to make your kids call the police pigs and fascists. For a decade, disband police agencies watching over subverters and radicals by calling them spies. This is exactly what American Union of Civil Liberties did. Stage campaign after campaign of discreditation and investigation of the wrongdoings of the police, and in 20 years you arrive at the present situation when the majority of civilian population of this nation is virtually without civil laws or protection from murderers, lunatics, criminals, etc. Can you now expect your police and civil authorities to protect you and your family in case of terrorist attack or a major civil disturbance? The American FBI and CIA have had no better treatment. Americans are made to believe that your own security agencies pose more danger than the Soviet KGB. There were dozens of quote-unquote revelation and exposés on the CIA during the last 10 to 15 years. But there was not a single public trial of any Soviet agent of the KGB caught in the USA red-handed. There were numerous expulsions of Soviet diplomats, yes, but an equal or greater number of them came to America to replace their fallen comrades. There is not a single law in America which could be used to legally prosecute KGB agents for ideological subversion, but there is a law that prevents your CIA from using your media to vindicate their acts to protect you against the KGB subversion. Your media and your Hollywood entertainers lovingly repeat every fabrication of Soviet propaganda regarding the CIA atrocities, mixing it with truth, half-truth, and blatant lie. Demoralizers like Larry Flynt regularly entertain the public with juicy stories about CIA assassinations, sandwiched between pornographic pictures in his magazine. Do you remember when you saw an American film or read a book about the good CIA? I do not imply that pornographer Flint or members of Rockefeller Commission on CIA are on the KGB payroll, but obviously pornography as well as political prostitution pays. It sells Hustler magazine, it sells politicians, and it kills the security of America. Criticism of the KGB does not pay. In fact, critics of KGB subverters may get killed in the process. What are you, my dear Americans? A nation of masochists and cowards? When you read and listen to all this dirt poured upon your security agencies by the media and politicians, can't you realize that the most just and factual criticism of the CIA is wrongly addressed? Security agencies of America, unlike the KGB, are instruments in the hands of a nation and her elected politicians. One should not blame an instrument when it is the operator's fault. If the instrument malfunctions, correct it, and don't use a hammer where a fine screwdriver is needed. Very often American media presents a picture of CIA and FBI as a mirror reflection of the KGB and its fraternal services. False. The KGB is a power which systematically and ruthlessly murdered about 60 million of my countrymen and still engages in the killing of innocent, defenseless people all over the world. How many were killed by the CIA? Do numbers and quality too matter at all to you? Or was Comrade Stalin right when he said that one person shot is a tragedy, but 1 million is statistics? Now let's look at how you treat your military. What is the image of the military presented to you and the rest of the world in American press? In the electronic media, if there is a U.S. general, he is called a trigger-happy warmonger, a hawk, an aggressor. One of the most popular TV series, MASH, presents your military as a bunch of very humorous, hysterically funny bunch of psychotics, queers, alcoholics, and otherwise rather unruly characters. Recently I saw a film titled Rage, where the Pentagon is depicted as a cruel experimenter testing chemical weapons on unsuspecting American farmers. And it is shown on TV exactly at the very same time when Soviets are using chemical weapons in Afghanistan, Cambodia, and Laos, and provide the same to their Iraqi brothers for their fraternal genocide in Persian Gulf. Have you ever seen a movie or a TV series about that? Every American student knows the name of the Vietnamese village My Lai and what it stands for, namely an American war crime. Do you remember the name of the Soviet pilot who shot down the Korean passenger airliner with 269 passengers aboard, including some 60 Americans and a U.S. senator? Do you remember the name of that senator? Does anybody in America ever learn from American media the names of thousands of Cambodian and Afghani villages totally exterminated by the Soviet military? Where is Jane Fonda and Dr. Spock, who used to express so much concern and love for Vietnamese and Cambodians when the U.S. military was there? The double standard applied and enforced and legitimized by the manipulators of public opinion in the USA is a direct result of the long-term process of the demoralization of the image of the U.S. military in the minds of millions all over the world. The result: study the chart. Quiet diplomacy or surrender. There are hundreds of volumes written about the ways communists use foreign relations for their purposes. There are none which reveal the link between the failures of American diplomacy and the process of demoralization. From time to time, defectors from the communist side, such as Arkady Shevchenko, the USSR representative in the UN, give breathtaking accounts of how the communists are using diplomacy for subversion. And yet, all the crowds of experts and Kremlinologists are seemingly unable to put the pieces together and to raise their voices against dealing with the communists in a diplomatic way. Many public figures have noticed that most of Americans do not want to hear unpleasant things. Politicians in the USA know this, so does the KGB. Every American administration has contributed to the process of demoralization of their own foreign policy by continuously negotiating and signing peace treaties, from the Lend-Lease to the Helsinki Accord to the SALT treaties, creating false expectations and voter complacency, and never openly and honestly admitting that none of these agreements and treaties ever worked, for America that is. They all benefited the USSR. In the process, America has lost most of her foreign friends to the socialist camp, concentration camp to be precise. Presently, the USA is rapidly nearing a situation of total isolation from the rest of the world. Even our longtime friend Great Britain did not support America, even verbally, on the liberation of Grenada, despite the obvious fact that America was on the British side in the ridiculous war over the Falkland Islands. What could be more amoral than the peace with honor signed by Kissinger with Hanoi communists? Ask the Vietnamese boat people. When someone makes a deal with a murderer, we call him accomplice in crime. We don't award him with Nobel Peace Prize, or do we? What should we call this kind of foreign policy, which is both amoral and hurts America? Level 3. Unhealthy body, unhealthy mind. Demoralization in such areas as family life, health services, interracial relations, population control and distribution, and labor relations I call the life level. Marxist-Leninist ideology coded in various indigenous social theories have greatly contributed to the process of American family breakup. The trend recently is changing in the opposite direction, but many generations of Americans brought up in broken families are already adults, lacking one of the most vital qualities for the survival of a nation: loyalty. A child who has not learned to be loyal to his family will hardly make a loyal citizen. Such child may grow into an adult who is loyal to the state, though. The USSR example is rather revealing in this case. In the struggle for the final victory of communism, the goal of the subverter is to substitute, as slowly and painlessly as possible, the concept of loyalty for nation with loyalty to the big brother welfare state, who gives everything and is able to take everything, including personal freedom, from every citizen. If that objective is successfully achieved, the subverter does not need any nuclear warheads and tanks, and may not even need the physical military invasion. All that will be needed is to elect a progressive thinking president who will be voted to power by Americans who have been addicted to welfare and security as defined by Soviet subverters. Very similar methods are being used in the area of medical and health services and sports, as part of an activity meant to keep the population healthy. By encouraging professionalism in spectator sports, rather than encouraging individual sports participation, America enfeebles herself as a nation. Most American adults who love sports watch TV sports programs while munching pretzels with their beer and not taking physical participation in sports actively. Unlike in the USSR, sports is not a compulsory part of elementary education in America. Impressive victories of Soviet athletes at international competitions further facilitate the ideas of the supremacy of socialism in the area of public health, thus convincing more and more Americans of the need to emulate the Soviet system and introduce it into the American schools. What many Americans do not realize is that what they see on the TV screens is not real Soviet sport. The majority of the USSR population is not athletic at all. They are sick from the lack of correct nutrition and alcoholism. Soviet athletes are state-created exceptions to the general national deterioration in the USSR. A similar myth is being promoted in the United States about free health care in the USSR. While working in Moscow, accompanying numerous foreign delegations and showing them regular medical facilities and clinics and hospitals, my guests did not all realize that I was taking them to specially prepared exclusive medical establishments only for the eyes of foreigners. When I arranged interviews with Soviet doctors telling my guests about the glorious achievements of Soviet surgery, some of them had no way of checking if these achievements were available to USSR collective farmers or workers in Siberia. They are not, and many Americans know about this, although they have never visited my old country. Yet the tendency of U.S. bureaucrats is to enlarge the state-run Medicare, despite the fact that, as shown in the USSR and elsewhere, socialized medicine is substandard, less efficient, and most definitely less progressive than privately owned and operated medical facilities within a properly functioning free market system. Demoralization in the area of food consumption patterns is also effective in the introduction of such things as junk foods. No KGB agents do not put chemicals into American food and drink. It is done by some American mega monopolies who operate along the same principles as Soviet Audiobook public food service. They look at consumers as units of consumers, not individuals, abolishing freely competing small food companies who had to treat you individually to survive economically. These giants of indigestion artificially create consumers' taste and demands, which may not be in the interest of your health, but surely in the interest of the monopoly profit. And here I tend to agree, at least in part, with America's Ralph Nader's and consumers' protection groups, although do not share their ideas on the solution of the problem. Racial and ethnic interrelations is one of the most vulnerable areas for demoralization. There is not a single communist country where racial groups are equal and enjoy as much freedom to develop themselves culturally and economically as in America. Actually, there are not too many capitalist countries where ethnic minorities have it as good as in the USA. I have been to many countries of the world, and I can state to you, my dear Americans, that your society is the least discriminatory. The communist solution for racial problem is final. They simply murder those who are different and stubbornly insist on remaining different. Stalin played with whole populations of ethnics, resettling Estonians, Latvians, and Lithuanians in Siberia, relocating Crimean Tatars from the tropics to permafrost, and Koreans from the Far East to the Kazakhstan deserts. But unfortunately, an average American never recalls these commonly known facts when his attention is drawn to domestic racial discrimination issues by those who profess racial harmony along the socialist principle guidelines. Why? Simple. Because American race discrimination fighters never mention these facts. If the USA were located on a separate planet from the communists, I would probably agree with Martin Luther King when he said that America is a racist country. But when these statements are made on this planet and in the most integrated nation in the world, I say to your fighters for racial equality, you are hypocrites and instruments, even if unwilling, of demoralization. The American traditional solution of racial and ethnic problems is slow but efficient. The melting pot which raises the less developed groups to a higher level. It has worked for more than a century of American history and created the most harmonious and productive nation on earth. The present-day solution to racial inequality is borrowed from communist mythology. Equality of all racial and ethnic groups, legislated by the government and enforced by state bureaucracies. We know perfectly well that neither races nor individuals are equal in every respect. We know that every nation and race has its peculiar character, abilities, traditions, mentality, and ability to learn at its individual pace of development. By mimicking the Soviet national policy of equality, America simply erases the distinct racial characteristics that have made this country great. Very briefly on population distribution. Urbanization and delandization, the taking away of private land, is the greatest threat to American nationhood. Why? Because the poor farmer often is a greater patriot than an affluent dweller of a large, congested American city. Communists know this very well. The Soviets keep a very tight control over the size of their cities by the system of police registration of residents called propiska. They know perfectly well that the farmer will fight an invader until the last bullet on his land. Underprivileged or urbanized masses, on the other hand, may feel like meeting an invader with flowers and red banners. Alienation of people from privately owned land is one of the very important methods of demoralization. And finally, we come to the last but not least important area, labor relations. I don't think I have to tell you about ideological infiltration of some labor unions in the USA. This is a well-documented part of your history. Moscow International Trade Union School, a KGB incubator for agents, takes care of physical infiltration of labor unions. That is also well known, even to the CIA, in fact. What I would like you to think about today is this: what sort of morality it takes to make medical nurses leave sick and dying patients in hospital beds and walk out to strike for 50 cents an hour more in pay. Okay? For a full dollar more. What makes unionized electricians leave a city without power in the middle of a severe winter and let several children in underprivileged slums freeze to death? How desperate for money must a unionized truck driver be to shoot to death a strike-breaking colleague, father of 5? Surely each individual American who commits these outrageously amoral acts is not that cruel and egocentric, and let's face it, not that broke. So why? My answer is ideological demoralization. The bargaining process in American labor in many instances is no longer motivated by the desire to improve working conditions and wages. In many cases, it is not bargaining at all. It's blackmail. And in the process of the unlimited growth of union power, the American worker loses the only relevant and real freedom he has in this country: the freedom to choose to work or not to work, and for how much. If an individual prefers to work for lower pay, and it must be his free and individual choice, he often is no longer able to do so. I have just mentioned what happens to strike breakers in America. Stage 2 of the 4 stages of subversion. Destabilization. Here, the efforts of subverter narrow down to the essentials, the internal power structures of a target nation, the nation's foreign relations, economy, and social fiber. If the preceding stage of demoralization is successful, the subverter no longer has to bother about your ideas and your life. Now he gets to the spinal cord of your country and helps you to bring your own society into the state of destabilization. That may take from 2 to 5 years, depending on the maturity of a nation and its ability to mobilize for resistance. Power struggle. The first symptom of instability is expressed as the desire of the population to bring to power those politicians and parties who are charismatic, act like good caretakers, and promise more security. not from external and foreign enemies, but rather job security, free social services, and other pleasure strokes provided by Big Brother. By concentrating the attention of a nation on short-term solutions and improvements, such irresponsible politicians simply procrastinate on facing the moment of truth, when the nation will have to pay a much higher price for the main and basic problem, bringing the country back to stability and restoring the moral fiber. A compounding factor at this stage is the so-called grassroots participation of the masses in the political process. Demoralized and enfeebled masses tend to grab the easiest shortcut solution to social ills, and socialism seems to them to be the best answer. Traditional national institutions no longer appear efficient. They are gradually replaced by artificially created citizens' communities and boards, which acquire more and more political power. These bodies, which are in essence mirror reflections of the totalitarian structures of power, are more and more responsive to mobocracy, the rule of the crowd of radicalized consumers. At the same time, the backbone of the economy, the free bargaining process, gradually yields to the principle of planned economy and centralization. With the final destruction of the free bargaining process, the predominant economic power moves into the hands of Big Brother, the state, which functions more and more in cahoots with mega monopolies and monopolized labor unions. The famous division of powers no longer governs the judicial, legislative, and executive lines, but rather is replaced by bureaucracy in government, bureaucracy in business, and bureaucracy in labor. In the area of foreign relations, America is being pushed further and further into isolationism and defeatism. Few remaining friends look with horror at the destiny of those nations who were betrayed and abandoned by the USA and try to find their own solutions, which often comes as establishing friendly relations with the USSR and its communist empire. The belligerent encirclement of America proceeds with an ever-increasing pace, and demoralized politicians are no longer able or willing to face the inevitable reality. Soviet and Cuban military supplies and direct intervention seem to the U.S. legislators to be less dangerous than America's losing face by violating international laws, by mining Nicaraguan ports to prevent the export of communist revolution to the region. The majority of Americans are made to believe that it is their country, America, who violates international law, not the USSR and its surrogates. The average American may not even realize that the International Court is nothing but an artificial creature of the Soviet-controlled General Assembly of the UN. All through this stage of destabilization, Western multinational monopolies continue to trade, extend credits, supply technology, and diplomatically appease the subverter. The Central Committee of the USSR, in total disregard of the interests of the peoples of America and the USSR, these two giants continue to extend aid to each other. American media keeps talking about frictions between the nations, USA and the USSR. What frictions? Comrade Pertov in Omsk has no frictions with Mr. Smith in Pittsburgh. In fact, they never had a chance to meet each other thanks to Helsinki Accord. Comrade Petrov, though, has frictions with his oppressors, the Kremlin junta, which sends him to make war on Afghanistan, Vietnam, Angola, and Nicaragua. Comrade Petrov does not want war with America. Neither does Mr. Smith want to fight Russia, but they may have to if the destabilization process is successful in America. Once it is, the situation inevitably slides into crisis. Stage 3. It may take only 2 to 6 months to bring America to the same situation which now exists south of the border in Central America. At this stage of subversion, you will have all your American radicals and Soviet sleeper agents springing into action, trying to seize power as quickly and ruthlessly as possible. If all the previous stages of Soviet subversion have been successfully completed by that time, the majority of Americans will be so totally confused that they may even welcome some quote-unquote strong leaders who know how to talk to the Russians. Chances are these leaders will be elected and given almost unlimited emergency powers. A forceful change of the U.S. system may or may not be accomplished through a civil war or internal revolution, and a physical military invasion by the USSR may not even have to take place at all. But change it will be, and rather a drastic one, with all the familiar attributes of Soviet progress being instituted, such as nationalization of vital industries, the reduction of the private sector of the economy to the bare minimum, the redistribution of wealth, and a massive propaganda campaign by the newly elected government to explain and justify the reforms. No concentration camps and executions, not yet. That will come later at the stage of normalization, the fourth and last stage. Any normal nation would definitely resist such a progressive change, as I have just described, and according to the classics of Marxism-Leninism, there will arise pockets of resistance shortly after the takeover, consisting of the enemy classes and counter-revolutionaries who will physically resist the new system. Some Americans may take to arms and flee to the mountains, as in Afghanistan. Reforms or destruction, to be more accurate, of the security agencies, police and military by the new government may lead to a situation of split loyalties among law enforcement officers and render the majority of the population defenseless. At this point, to avoid the bloodshed, the subverter moves to normalization, a term borrowed from the Soviet propaganda of 1968, from the time of the Soviet fraternal invasion of Czechoslovakia. Comrade Brezhnev called that normalization, and he was right. The vanquished country was brought by force into the normal state of socialism, namely subjugation. This is when, my dear friends, you will start seeing friendly Soviet soldiers in the streets of our cities working together with American soldiers and the new police force to restore law and order. Very soon your yesterdays, American socialist radicals and do-gooders who were working so hard to bring progress to their own country will find themselves in prisons and hastily built concentration camps. Many of them will be executed quietly or publicly. Why? Simple. The Soviet liberators will have no further use for the disturbers. The useful idiots will have completed their work. From then on, the new order will need stability and new morality. No more grassroots movements. No more criticism of the state. The press will obediently censor itself. In fact, this censorship is already existing now, imposed by the so-called U.S. liberals and socialist do-gooders. You will now have the opportunity to enjoy exactly the same life as the Vietnamese, Cambodians, Angolans, and Nicaraguans. This state of social normalization may last forever. That is, your lifetime and lifetimes of your children and grandchildren. it will never happen here. What if it does happen here? Why take chances? What are the solutions? There are different solutions for different stages of subversion. If a nation has enough common sense to stop subversion at the very beginning of the demoralization stage, you may never need the painful and drastic solutions needed to deal with the crisis stage. The most general solution I can offer for the whole process of subversion is to stop aiding the subverter. You are still living in a free society, and you are able to force your elected politicians to change their policies toward the communist world if you so choose. But if you personally do not see anything wrong in dealing with the communists and helping them in their global expansion, I feel that you should begin learning more about the reality of the communist socialist situation, not from your monopolized media, but from the independent media and press, who have no vested interest in making out the Soviet Union to be the good guys, and from people like myself who have experienced communism firsthand for many years. There are numerous American patriotic groups and organizations who are well informed and who already have many solutions to combat the damage done by ideological subversion. Some of them are as good, if not better, than mine. Seek these groups, join them, and do something. This booklet is my love letter to America. I did not write it to frighten or threaten the nation that I love for its freedom, its principles, its ideals. But if you were walking across the street with a friend and saw a car barreling down upon you both that your friend did not see, would you say nothing to your friend and move out of the way, leaving him to be hit? Of course not, and I do not intend to do that to you. In my next booklet, I will cover the full solutions to the problem of ideological subversion. I sincerely hope you will be reading it. Love, Tomas Schuman.